you keep one hand completely clean, and you have whatever's handling the seeds needs to be completely clean, so that you're not gluing your seeds together and you're not mixing mud in with your seeds, making it difficult to distribute the seeds.
Seed handling. How do you handle seeds when you're planting in our raised beds?
I get the bed completely ready. I figured out my spacing. I'll draw lines, or I'll make holes, or whatever I'm going to do for the seeds. And then I normally pour the seeds into the palm of my left hand because I'm right-handed, and I put them in like that. Now, I may take several seeds at a time. If they're round seeds, I can grab 3 or 4 round seeds between my fingers and do like that. And
So you roll them out.
I roll them out. I can roll them out one at a time. Because I don't like to have to thin, and I don't like to waste seeds, I try and get them where I want them the first time around, not have to fuss with them, and I can do that very quickly. It's pretty amazing. I remember when it used to feel like it took me forever to plant something like a bean bed. Now I'm like, zoom, and I'm like, oh, it's done. Okay, But that's because I have a good sense. I mean, I know people who have to measure in between seeds because they can't eyeball it.
Yeah, if you can't measure, make a small stick or something that gives you the seed spacing that you need.
Right. Or learn how wide are 3 fingers?
Or 2
fingers. How wide are
fingers.
4 fingers? How wide are 2 fingers? And we know people who actually have tattoos on their hands of rulers.
Not me.
I used to work as an archaeologist in the field, and I just got to be good at guessing distances. I can still, when I go to a museum, tell the difference between a centimeter and an inch and this and that and the other thing. And sometimes you look at a piece and you're like, that's a centimeter. Why would I call it some portion of an inch when I can say it's a centimeter? But you can use your fingers, so you don't have to carry sticks or rulers or anything else. You always have that hand with you, assuming nothing's gotten chopped off. So if you know that your seed should go every 4 inches, well, that's about 3 right there.
That's for Irene's hands. She has large hands.
For a female, I do.
My hands are smaller than many males.
My fingers are longer.
Yeah. Oh well.
Hey,
my fingers work.
They work. That's all the other thing that matters. But learn to use your own fingers. I know a lot of people who measure using the joints on their fingers too. Yeah. You always have them with you. Hopefully. The hardest thing I've ever had to plant is if you use inoculant on seeds. Sometimes an
inoculant is a mixture that you're going to put on the seeds to put a bacteria around it that's a beneficial bacteria. Mm-hmm. For example, some seeds benefit by having some specific bacteria that's nitrogen fixing. So it'll create nodules.
All your legumes.
So it'll create nodules on the roots.
Now, the one thing I found, research is showing us these days that you don't have to use it every year. Some of the companies will say, oh, always you must use this every year. Well, of course they want to sell you stuff. But the fact is, if you've been growing legumes in your beds and you've been inoculating every year, you don't need to do it every year. I won't say it's a waste of money. It is a pain in the patootie. The reason being, the way you apply this stuff to seeds is you get them wet. So you get this plastic container full of mud, because it's a fine mud when it gets. It's a powder that turns into a fine mud when you mix it with water. Now you've got the slurry on all your seeds, and it works.
Works great.
But it's a pain because now you're covered with goop, and you're trying to sort the individual seeds out, and you're trying to distribute it can get to be
an awful lot of what we're talking about here is really having to do with the fact that we as home gardeners, we're not a market garden, we're not a commercial garden, we're growing primarily for our own consumption. A lot of times we're not going to use the entire contents of the specific seed packet.
Right.
Which means that we're going to fold it back up and put it away, and we'll use it the next year.
Right, and even if we use the entire packet, we're not using any fancy seeders or anything like that because we're working in raised beds. I mean, I have to admit, I am jealous of the people who can work in in-ground beds, and we have in the past had gardens in in-ground beds, and I adored them. However, right now, where we live, raised beds are the only thing that makes sense. That and containers. And that I'm not going to pick up a seeder and walk down inside the whole point of having a raised bed is that you're not compacting the soil. So I try not to step into the raised bed more than I have to.
Yeah, the other reason for our raised beds is because that's how we end up with soil, because we make our soil in the raised bed, trying to make soil out here in our very, very poor and depleted soil. Boy, there's air quotes, soil. Trying to make soil out of our essentially subsoil is a lengthy, lengthy process, and we're not that young that we can afford to wait 10 years to create soil.
Right, right. So we tend to add compost and stuff every year. If you live in a warmer climate, if you were to take a pot and fill it to the top with dirt and pack it in there so there's no air spaces or anything, and leave it over the course of the summer with a plant or something growing in it, the level of that soil is going to diminish over the summer. The warmer the climate, the faster that soil will diminish in volume. And that is because the microbes that are in the soil are simply eating it, literally. They call it burning out the organics. And if you live in a colder climate, this does not happen anywhere near as fast. So for us living in a very hot climate, you know, we can literally top our beds to the point where they're bulging, and it's a little hard to water when we start at the beginning of the year. And by the end of the summer, they're down.
Yeah, we'll lose 5 inches easy over the course of a year. But the real thing is you want there to be enough moisture. Right now you can feel the moisture in the top of the pot with the back of your knuckles. You don't want it to be soup, but you want it to be damp. Is it better to be too wet or too dry, Irene?
When you're starting seeds, too wet.
And what about when they're getting ready to produce? Don't make them too wet and don't make it too dry.
Yeah, it becomes a balancing act. The problem is if you get them wet enough while you're growing them, you'll rot them, especially if the soil is cold. If the soil is warm enough, even if it's a little extra soggy, you'll be fine, because it just means they'll pop faster and everything else, and then you'll be able to see that the soil, it should not be glistening wet all the time. It really shouldn't be. If you have proper drainage holes in the bottom of your pot, it should drain out. When you are farther along in the production, too wet a soil on tomatoes will cause tomatoes to split. It can cause cabbages to split. It can cause potatoes to rot in the ground. It can cause all kinds of nasty stuff. But the opposite, too dry, is not a good thing either. So that's where you have to be paying attention, where I recommend, like, you'll see me all last summer, I'd do it. I'd run the irrigation out there, and then I'd go out and I would check a couple of inches below the top of the surface of the soil to see what's going on down there. You know, did the irrigation not run quite right in this part of the bed? Is it soggy over there, but it's not wet enough over here? You know, this plant is wilting. What's going on? Is it drowning? Or is it drying up?
Well, there's a lot to know about the individual plant's behavior to drying conditions, and more importantly, temperatures. So for example, here we had many weeks of over 100-degree temperatures with full sun.
Right.
And some things, like squash, for example,
will wilt during the middle of the day.
And so will tomatoes,
yes,
surprisingly.
They cannot bring water from their roots up to their leaves fast enough. And what they do is they actually purposefully wilt, and that controls the amount of water they lose. And then, you know, you'll be sitting there going, oh, my poor plants, and you'll come out after supper and everything looks great, because it's that time to play catch up. It's like when we go outside and work a little too hard, and we don't drink quite enough water, then we drink some, now we feel better later. It's the same thing. They can only transpire, which is the process of releasing water from their leaves, so fast and bring water up so fast through their roots. So they tend to wilt a bit in the hottest part of the day, no matter how much water. I mean, you could have them sitting in a bucket of water and they would still do the same thing.
That's here in the desert, northern Arizona high desert.
Right.
That's an issue for us. It's different places.
I saw it in New Mexico too, and that was a moderate desert area.
There's a lot of different ways to deal with summer heat. We're not going to go into all of them now, but if you look at some of the people who grow, let's say in South Georgia, for example, Haas Tools and their experimental plots, they'll use overhead watering in the summertime. But the issue
Cool.
there, the issue for them then,
Yeah.
they can get it to drain off, but there's really a big issue for them in a dry year. They may run their well dry, which means that they won't be able to irrigate at all. But the other thing is, you have some aggressive fungus that can cause all manner of problems.
Everything you do is a balancing act. We use drip irrigation to water our plants because water is a premium here. We can't afford to overhead water very often. We've heard house tools say on multiple occasions when they got a horrible hot spell and the plants were just croaking out there because it was just too hot. They literally use overhead sprayers to cool the air, the same way as people use misters down here, say in Phoenix or something like that, to cool the air. You could easily drop the air temperature 10 degrees like that with a mister. Now, the problem for us here is you're wasting water. The additional problem after that becomes it encourages fungus like crazy. So, balancing act. I'll stick with the drip irrigation where we are. And we have very, very, very aggressive funguses in Arizona because they are accustomed to having to go through their life cycle very quickly.